You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 129, covering the week of July 9th through July 13th, 2018. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, all the usual things. You can follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute. You can like us on Facebook at Abbeville Institute. And you can subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. If you don't want to find all those things, just going out to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, you'll find all our social media buttons. And while you're there, give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sales Emancipation Hell. Also, remember that we exist on your generous contributions alone. And so if you'd like to help us continue what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition, to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, you can do so by, at the top of the page, you'll see a button that says support. Under that, you have donor options. You can use our new donor interface, You can donate as little as $3 a month if you're a student, or $5 a month if you're not a student, or $25 a year if you're a student, or $50 a year if you're not a student. And you can help us continue our mission, help us keep the podcast going, the lights on, help us provide for our conferences, our website, all the things that we do that are all free, by the way. We provide a fabulous website that has well over 1,000 articles for free. I mean, this is an amazing thing, and so anything you want to do to help us is greatly appreciated. Also remember that you can download our app from your favorite app store, whether it's Google Play or iTunes, and you can have Abbeville Institute on the go. So that's also free, going out there to your favorite store and pick that up. And of course, you can get your Abbeville Institute merchandise at the top of the page again, where it says support. You have an option for shop, and you click on that, and you will be taken to our apparel store where you can buy your hats, shirts, golf towels, a lot of cool stuff out there. So going out and get that material as well. It's all embroidered, so it's going to last a long time. It's not screen printed. It's embroidered material, and so it's very, very nice. We've got our summer school coming up this next week, and I'm really excited about that. I will be podcasting live from the summer school. So if you're hearing this before the summer school, the next podcast will actually be live, so you can hear what's going on there. I'll actually be doing some interviews. I hope to be interviewing Bobby Horton for our banquet before our banquet presentation. So there's going to be a lot of great stuff coming up in the podcast. Some of those will probably be bonus episodes. So if you do like this podcast, be on the lookout for those. All that said, don't forget that when you do give us that email address, you get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday, and our weekly email Saturday and Sunday with a link to this podcast. So when you give us that email address, you get in touch with us on a daily basis, just about. Again, with all of this free material. All of it's free. Amazing, amazing stuff. I think we have the best Southern website on the internet, without question. A lot of great stuff. So please continue to support our mission. We do appreciate anything you can do for us. Okay, well, let's talk about this week, because we had a lot of interesting material this week. And again, it's bookended with a nonfiction piece and then a fiction piece. It's something that we've done quite a bit before. We've run fiction. And Paul Yarborough is one of our fiction writers. He does a fantastic job with that. And he wrote a piece on Friday entitled, I Heard a Voice. And it works very nicely with the piece that we ran on Monday. So let's start with that Monday piece. It's written by one of the Kennedy brothers, and it's entitled, Is Dixie a Captive Nation? So Ronnie Kennedy wrote this. And he points out this is, I guess, Captive Nation Week. I mean, when he sent this to me, he said, this is Captive Nation Week, so would you mind running this? And he brings up the fact that the South has been occupied since the end of the war. And this is based on the idea that, of course, for 4 years, the southern states were independent. And they lost that independence when they lost the war, but they never lost their cultural identity. Now, we can certainly say that when you look at, again, was exploring what's true and valuable in the southern tradition, that cultural identity has been watered down, it's been eroded, it's under attack on a constant daily basis, which is why we do this, which is why we do what we do, to try to ensure that the valuable parts of Southern culture and Southern tradition don't go away. But Ronnie is insisting here that the South, like other governments, has been occupied. Now, there were people that would scoff at this and say, well, but Southerners don't really care. They're participating in Congress and et cetera. They're not just under some type of military governor. Certainly after the war they were not participating in Congress. And if you look at Reconstruction, and for much of the period of time, many of those states were under military occupation. They were under the force of bayonets. They were not allowed to participate in the general government until they did certain things that allowed them to be full-fledged participants again. And so, just because that ended, and just because people acquiesced and said, okay, well, we're going to participate in this government again, doesn't mean that certain elements of the South have not been captive, quote-unquote captive. And again, this gets down to culture. The only section in the United States that anybody can pick on a regular basis and make jokes about and say that they're terrible are Southerners. It wasn't always this way, and I think one of the things that I'm going to point out in my talk next week about music is that for a long period of time, particularly in the early 20th century, Northerners talked about how much they loved the South. They loved it. They loved so many things about the South, and it was Southern culture that they loved more than anything else. They wrote about it all the time. The South is great. It's got all these, it's warm, the people are nice, the food's great. It's got great music. It's a slow, easy-paced lifestyle compared to what we have in the North. It's cleaner. The air is cleaner. It's wonderful down there. I want to go back to Dixie. I can't wait to get down to Dixie. And that was the case, I think, for most of the 20th century. And even to this day, with the reverse diaspora that's taking place. I mean, in the early 20th century, you had a diaspora from both white and black Southerners moving out of the South into other parts of the country. Millions of people. And now there's been a reverse trend of that, people coming back the other way, particularly African Americans, who are moving back in the South in large numbers because they don't like the cities of the North. But certainly Southern culture has been watered down, eroded. It's under tremendous pressure because of outside forces and people saying that it's backwards. Southerners are backwards people. They're stupid. And industrialization, the New South, this process of the New South, in the postbellum period, there was people like Henry Grady standing up and saying, we're a New South, we love the Old South, but the New South is better because, of course, we have industrialization. It's one of the things he was a champion of. And, of course, one of the reasons why he's doing that is to try to get Northern capital into the South to help rebuild it. You could make a case, this is kind of a side note. In World War II, you had people like George Marshall, who was very aware of what happened in the South during Reconstruction. And there is a theory that one of the reasons why you had the Marshall Plan is because Marshall knew what would happen if you destroyed a region. He's from the South. If you destroy a region and you don't rebuild it. He knew what would happen if you impoverished people and you didn't help them back up. And so this was part of the drive for the Marshall Plan, for the United States to go out and rebuild these areas that have been so thoroughly devastated by World War II. Not just to create allies, but as a humane thing to do. And we can quibble over how much money should have been spent. Should we still be spending this money? And should NATO still exist? And all these things that were byproducts of the Cold War. And the Marshall Plan can be viewed as a byproduct of the Cold War as well. People were concerned about the rise of communism in Europe and Asia. But I think there is something to this, I think. And a Southerner like Marshall saying, this is the humane thing to do. We can't just destroy an area like we did in the South. Now, he doesn't say that, but that's on his mind, I believe. You can't just destroy an area and then not help rebuild it. And that was not the Reconstruction plan. It was root, hog, or die. And then, of course, when you had the push for industrialization and the drive to get foreign capital, that's going to change the economy of the South. It's going to change the character of the South. And so that's where Paul Yarborough's piece comes in, this little fictional piece, I Heard a Voice. It's about I'm not going to steal the plot of the piece, or at least what happens, but it's about some bankers, industrialists looking out over the South, looking out over the land, and a Southerner comes up, and he says he doesn't have a country anymore. He's lost his country. And the conversation there and what happens, I think it really is, it's an amazing piece. He asked, when he emailed me, do you get my point? Of course. I mean, it's an amazing piece, and I think people should go read it. A great little short story. But that depression that Southerners felt, I mean, it was said after the war, you didn't find anyone in the South that actually smiled. People wore black. It was a hard time to be part of the southern states. And when you go back, there was a collection of primary materials by the Dunning School authors entitled A Documentary History of Reconstruction. And this thing is often derided because it's early 20th century, it's racist, all these other it's just a collection of primary materials. And there was an interesting piece in there, a story of a plantation owner who was he survived the war. Of course, he's an old man, and he was out trying to chop his own wood, and he couldn't do it. But he was going to try to do it because he had to try to provide for his family after the war's over. And this is the kind of thing that he couldn't get anybody to work on his farm anymore. It was a really hard time for him. But yet here he is, this guy, old man, with blisters on his hands, trying to chop his own wood just to survive. And a lot of Southerners were facing that, just surviving, just get through it. How do you get through this transitionary period? Now, not everyone was facing it. It was if you read, I don't know if I talked about it in the podcast. I can't remember if I talked about John Muir's travels through the South from Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico, and some of the things he came across. He came across a farmer in Georgia, a plantation owner, former plantation owner, that had actually gone out and sunk all of his equipment into a lake. And all his former slaves were still on the plantation, and he was paying them now. And he said, actually, this is a good thing. It's cheaper for me to pay them than it was for me to provide for them like I was. And they're trying to get the equipment out of the lake. And he did it because he didn't want the marauding Yankee army to come through and find his equipment. But what's also interesting is that he talks about how he asked to stay at this plantation house. You know, Muir didn't have any place to stay, and he's just trying to live off the kindness of strangers. And eventually they allowed him in. But they talked about how before that another traveler had come through and stolen all their stuff, and so they were very suspicious about Yankees coming in and staying with them. And Southerners were willing to do this, but how they were very suspicious about people coming through because of the threat of theft. Now, Muir is better known as the founder of the Sierra Club and maybe the modern environmentalist movement. And here he is talking about these, and he had some very what we would consider to be racist statements today about black Southerners. And he also talked about all the snakes he came across in the South. And it's just as he's traveling around the Chattahoochee River and all these snakes he's having to deal with, rattlesnakes and other things. And he's walking from Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico. And it's an interesting travel journal, but of course, the left won't put this out there because it portrays Muir in a pretty negative light in terms of his views on race. But I found it interesting and fascinating because of his description of some parts of the South. He talked about Athens quite a bit, but what it was like for Southerners trying to rebuild that section as a captive nation. And how they were losing their country when you got to the New South. And how when Southerners started being concerned with the stock market more than the cotton market, I mean, the South had changed. And I think that's what Paul Yarborough is trying to get to in this piece, I Heard a Voice. And it has that religious aspect to it. One of the main characters sings a Christian hymn during during the peace, and it's a powerful draw to what, in Mr. Yarbrough's mind, is traditional Southern culture and how it's being assaulted by outside influences, whether it's banks or industrialization, the land is being taken over. It's a reminder of what was lost and what is under attack. And this is what the agrarians were talking about in the 1930s. What was under attack in the South was that traditional provincialism, that agrarianism, that tie to the land, that tie to people in place, to kith and kin. That's what was being lost. And I think that this is why in my own podcast, in the Brian McClanahan Show, I talk about think locally, act locally. I mean, that's what I'm driving home. And people get this. And what's interesting is you have people that get it but don't understand that this really is, more than anything else, a Southern tradition. Now, it's not to say that other people aren't happy with where they live. They aren't happy with the place that they're from. And even the agrarians talked about, how there was a Northern culture. It existed. I mean, and how that, New Englanders had an interesting culture in and of their own right, and people that were very provincial in New England. And it was something to admire and hang on to. What they didn't want was that imperialism, that type of cultural imperialism, to abridge and destroy Southern culture. They didn't want that to happen. And that's the thing. I mean, if you had people in America, north, south, west, wherever it is, just simply worry about their own backyard, their own front porch, their own people in their own place, you wouldn't have the problems that we have in the United States today. It's all about cultural imperialism. It always has been. And that cultural imperialism, culture produces political culture, it produces the economic culture. It's cultural imperialism that's the problem. And so as you have one section or one people try to dominate another, you have cultural imperialism. And in the antebellum period, you had a strong New England cultural imperialism. So everything can be viewed in that lens. It's about power. It's all about power. And I think that's where, Dixie being a captive nation, I heard a voice where these two pieces fit nicely together. And then also the piece for Wednesday, which is Saving Architectural Treasures of the Old South. This is written by Robin Lattimore. He talks about how important it is for architecture to be part of the fabric of Southern tradition and Southern culture. And we miss that. I mean, Southern tradition and Southern culture is more than just food and music. And while those things are important, we're having a whole summer school on music, and we should have it on all the elements of Southern culture that really make it what it is. There's also architecture. This is an interesting, interesting topic in this. If you go back, and just using music as an example of this in one way, if you go back and look at music and album covers, and I always found album covers to be amazing pieces of art, because it's a window into what people were thinking about a time or a place, or what was important and how their music fit. And a friend of mine and I were in a used bookstore a few weeks back, and they had some old records in there, and we were looking at the records, and we pulled up a record, or he found it first, by Seals and Crofts, kind of a 1970s pop group, and they had an album entitled Taking It Easy. Taking It Easy. And the album cover was Seals and Crofts in front of a plantation house. And then you open it up, and they've got all these pictures of, fishing in the South and sipping mint juleps in the South. In the 70s, it was seen as plantation homes. It was taking it easy. And plantation homes, there was another, the Allman Brothers Band, their first album, they're standing in front of an antebellum home, and it's a ruin, essentially. There's columns. It is a Southern ruin. You see, nowhere else in America, well, I take that back. I mean, you look at Detroit now, you have the Detroit is falling down, the decay in Detroit. The ruins of Detroit are interesting, and some of these architectural treasures of Detroit that were interesting. But in the South, you have something, the architecture means something. And you have these ruins, like you would in, say, Greece or Rome. It's the ruins of a past culture. And so there's nowhere else in the United States that people try to preserve the architecture to preserve the culture of the time, the culture of the period. Nobody goes to the North and says, I want to tour Northern homes. I mean, sure, you have some interesting homes in the North. Some of the people that in the Gilded Age that produce these marvelous mansions. There's no question about that. I mean, you had that. For example, you had some of the famous homes in Newport, Rhode Island, or in the Hudson River Valley. But in the South, I mean, people will go out of their way just to go tour these Southern homes, these architectural treasures, because it speaks of a time and a place and a people unique in American history, a culture unique in American history. So these architectural treasures are vital to understanding the Old South and, by default, Southern culture, and then by default, the New South, and what we think about these things. And so when you go in and you tour these homes, unfortunately now you have contextualization. It's as if the people that lived there, that owned the home, that built the home, didn't even exist. And that's the context. All you'll get is that, yes, this is the Madison family. I've seen this in a piece on James Madison's home, for example. The Madison family occupied the house. Occupied the house. They didn't own it. They didn't build it. They occupied it. And the people that were important in that, of course, were the slaves that lived there. Not the Madison family. It's not the President of the United States. He just occupied the house. It's the terminology that's used now that's so striking in this. And it's unfortunate these treasures of the Old South are under assault from many different directions, whether it's because they're falling down, and a lot of them were destroyed, burned down. There was a beautiful old plantation home in Northern Virginia that was burned down by the fire department there just for practice in the 1960s. Can you imagine? The fire department went out and said, okay, we need to have practice in a house fire. So they burned down a beautiful old plantation home just to do it. And that's sad. It's a sad commentary on what was going on. This is in the 1960s now. This isn't last year. And when you look at Southern art, it's part of this. You look at the statues in Charlottesville that are on the National Register of Historic Places. These statues, Jackson and Lee, and people forget that there's also statues that were designed by paid for by the same benefactor of George Rogers Clark and Lewis and Clark. So it wasn't just Jackson and Lee. There are two statues that nobody talks about, built, paid for by the same individual on American history as well. And but those are ignored. Those are ignored. So they're part of American art. They're part of the fabric of American life, and of course Southern life. And tearing them down tears down the vitality of Southern culture and tradition. And the book review that we had on Tuesday speaks of this as well. America Aflame. It's actually a book about the coming of the war by David Goldfield. And David Goldfield will never be confused to be someone who's pro-Southern at all. I've used his textbook in my American history courses, and he's not pro-Southern. In some of the cases, he's pretty awful. But this particular book is interesting. He's anti-war. In fact, he says that he's anti-Civil War. So this is a book from an anti-war position written in 2011 in a time when people were discussing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And is there a precedent here with Americans and an anti-war tradition? And he says certainly there was. And he actually blames this war, and a lot of people took offense to this in this review and said, well, I'll never read this because he blames the war on evangelicals. And they said he doesn't distinguish enough between Puritans and other Christians. He does. and this is a short review. You have to get into the book. But he talks about how essentially the North created this conflict, America aflame. And there was that very famous burnt-over district in New York, and then you had, of course, he points back to the abolitionist movement as being this religious zeal. Part of the religious zeal behind that was destructive of America. Now, this is not a popular thesis, but Goldfield is a mainstream historian, and nobody gave him a lot of heat for this. I mean, that's interesting, because Goldfield is one of them, and he can do this. Of course, he's not laudatory of the South, but he is certainly very critical of the North and its complicity in bringing about the war. He basically says you cannot blame the entire war on the South. There has to be Northern complicity in this. There has to be something else to this. And so, look, this is, it's not Ludwell Johnson. It's not Craven or Randall, who both wrote fantastic books. Craven, in particular, about the coming of the war. Craven is very even-handed. Avery Craven, The Coming of the Civil War. It's a tremendous book. This book should go right along with that. And you're not going to find, again, a pro-Southern bias. And that's fine. You don't need that. In fact, it's in some ways more effective to not have that, particularly when you're speaking to people who aren't interested in the South. It's like going after them with a scalpel rather than a chainsaw. Sometimes the smallest cuts make the most difference. It's the argument. You're taking apart the argument with a scalpel, not a chainsaw, or you're hitting them with a ball peen hammer, not a sledgehammer. You're waking them up gently rather than just bludgeoning their head in. And that's okay. I mean, we need that. You need nuance at times to persuade. A lot of times our articles are sledgehammers, they're chainsaws. But every now and then it's good to have that scalpel. It's good to have that soft kid glove approach to get people to understand, well, wait a second here. I mean, there's something else to this. And I think Goldfield does a good job with that. Again, you would never confuse him as being pro-Southern. He's very critical of the South. But he's also very critical of the North, and that's a good thing. And so you do have some of these historians, mainstream historians, who are starting to look at the North with a much more critical eye and starting to examine Northern complicity and bringing about the war. And so this book does a very good job of that. And, it's one that you should pick up, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything he says. You should pick it up because it has a nice critique of the war and putting the burden back on the North where it belongs in reality for bringing about this war and, of course, the sectional conflict. And then finally we had a very long piece written by Vito Musamelli, Sam Houston and Texas secession. It's an important topic to talk about Sam Houston because I think, he is misunderstood. Houston was a constitutional unionist, essentially. I mean, there was some discussion about making him their presidential nominee in 1860, and they picked John Bell of Tennessee instead. He was a Southerner. I mean, Houston was one of the most important individuals in Southern history. The guy, one of the heroes of the Texas independence movement. Of course, he opposed secession. And this piece does a nice job in bringing out why. He was also very critical of Abraham Lincoln. He's very critical of the Republican Party. He was a pure Southerner, but he did not think that dissolving the Union was best for the South long term. And there were a lot of Southerners who thought this way. And I mean, you find that all over the South. You find it in these individuals who thought, well, I mean, this is going to actually be destructive of the South if we secede. It's going to destroy us long term. It's not going to be beneficial, particularly if we lose the war, which a lot of people thought was going to come. And how that would be dangerous to the security of the South. It wouldn't be beneficial. So understanding Sam Houston and understanding these Unionists at the time, I think is an interesting part of Southern history. And of course, Sam Houston being a real Southern hero, someone who was, someone that people should know about in the South, someone that people should understand. in the South, and of course in Texas history. So Vito does a very nice job. It's a long piece, again a long piece, and it's full of primary material. It's well worth your time to read it and to try to better understand Sam Houston and his role in the not just in the 1860s, but also before that as a real son of Virginia and then a son of Texas, and how that Southern culture was so important in his life and his viewpoints. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Again, the next one is going to be a live podcast. It's not going to be broadcast live, but I'll be recording it live, so we'll have a live audience, and it'll be fun. Hopefully, you'll enjoy that. Podcast 130. Then is going to be a special episode, and we'll have some other episodes that are going to be interviews that will be kind of bonus episodes in future weeks. So be on the lookout for those. But until next time, good day.
Thank you.